For more than a century, one argument has quietly shaped revolutions, economies, and the daily lives of billions without most people ever noticing its full weight. Capitalism and socialism were never just academic ideas debated in universities. They became competing visions for how society itself should function. One promised freedom through markets and individual ambition. The other promised fairness through collective organization and shared security. Nations aligned themselves around these principles, wars reflected them, and policies were justified in their name. Understanding modern civilization means understanding this rivalry, not as ideology, but as a historical experiment conducted at global scale. Long before economic ideologies carried names or political identities, human societies operated under systems defined by survival rather than theory. Wealth was inseparable from land. Authority flowed through monarchs and aristocracies, and production existed primarily to sustain hierarchy rather than expand opportunity. Trade occurred, but mobility remained rare, and most people lived and died within rigid social structures that barely changed across generations. Gradually, population growth, expanding commerce, and technological experimentation began straining this static order. Markets widened, merchants accumulated influence, and the idea quietly emerged that wealth might be created through exchange and innovation rather than inherited power alone. The Industrial Revolution did not simply introduce machines. It fundamentally reorganized how wealth, labor, and power interacted. Factories concentrated production in cities, capital accumulated in private hands, and productivity began expanding at a pace unseen in human history. For the first time, economic growth became continuous rather than occasional, driven by investment, innovation, and competition. Yet this transformation carried contradiction. While new industries generated unprecedented prosperity, they also produced overcrowded cities, harsh labor conditions, and widening inequality. Industrial capitalism proved capable of creating abundance, but it simultaneously exposed the social tensions embedded within rapid economic change. As factories expanded and wealth concentrated, a growing number of observers began questioning whether industrial progress truly served society as a whole. Workers faced long hours, unstable wages, and living conditions that contrasted sharply with the fortunes accumulating among industrial owners. Intellectuals and activists started interpreting these disparities not as temporary growing pains, but as structural flaws within the economic order itself. Socialism emerged from this environment as both critique and alternative, proposing collective ownership and planned production as solutions to exploitation. It reframed inequality as a systemic outcome rather than an individual failure, transforming social discontent into organized political thought. Ideas remained theoretical until governments attempted to organize entire economies around socialist principles. In the aftermath of political upheaval and social collapse, revolutionary leaders sought to replace markets with centralized planning, believing coordination could eliminate inequality and instability. Industries were nationalized, production targets replaced profit incentives, and economic decisions moved from entrepreneurs to state administrators. Initial gains in industrial mobilization and social restructuring created an impression of rapid transformation. Yet over time, information gaps, weak incentives, and bureaucratic rigidity revealed persistent inefficiencies, exposing the tension between ideological design and the unpredictable complexity of real economies. The expansion of market economies brought remarkable growth, yet also exposed cycles of instability that periodically shook public confidence. Financial speculation, uneven wealth distribution, and fragile banking systems created moments when prosperity unraveled with startling speed. Economic downturns were not isolated accidents, but systemic stress tests revealing vulnerabilities within market-driven structures. Mass unemployment, collapsing industries, and social unrest forced societies to question whether unfettered capitalism could sustain long-term stability. These crises challenge the assumption that markets naturally self-correct, compelling governments and citizens alike to reconsider how economic freedom should be balanced with collective protection. By the 20th century, economic theories were no longer confined to debate. They divided the world into competing systems tested under real political and social pressure. Nations organized alliances, rebuilt economies, and structured entire societies according to opposing economic visions. Industrial output, technological advancement, military capacity, and living standards became measures of ideological success. This confrontation transformed economic philosophy into lived experience for millions, turning everyday production and consumption into evidence within a global experiment. What mattered was no longer theoretical promise, but performance under sustained competition across decades of geopolitical tension and economic rivalry. As decades passed, comparison between competing systems shifted from ideology to measurable outcomes. Socialist economies demonstrated rapid industrialization and centralized mobilization, achieving significant gains in education, infrastructure, and military capability. Yet these achievements increasingly contrasted with shortages, limited consumer choice, and slowing innovation. Meanwhile, capitalist economies combined private enterprise with expanding regulatory frameworks and social programs, generating sustained growth alongside rising living standards. The Cold War transformed economics into a performance test conducted in parallel societies, where productivity, technological progress, and everyday quality of life quietly became the decisive indicators of systemic effectiveness. Over time, the promise of pure ideological systems encountered the limits of economic reality and human behavior. Centralized models struggled to sustain efficiency without flexibility, while unrestrained market systems repeatedly faced instability and social backlash. Rather than delivering definitive victory, history produced adaptation. Governments adjusted policies, blended mechanisms, and quietly abandoned rigid adherence to theory in favor of practical survival. The lesson emerging from these transformations was not ideological triumph, but institutional evolution. Systems endured only when they incorporated feedback, corrected failures, and reshaped themselves in response to changing economic and social pressures. Gradually, nations moved away from ideological purity and toward pragmatic balance. Market competition remained a driver of innovation, yet governments increasingly intervened to stabilize economies, provide social protections, and manage systemic risk. What emerged was neither capitalism nor socialism alone, but hybrid systems shaped by experience rather than theory. Across the modern world, economies operate as carefully negotiated blends rather than ideological absolutes. Some nations emphasize strong welfare institutions alongside competitive markets, while others combine state direction with private enterprise. These variations reveal a shared conclusion. Economic systems endure not through purity, but through continuous adjustment to national priorities and realities. History gradually clarified that each system excelled under certain conditions while failing under others. Market economies proved powerful engines of innovation and growth, but struggled with inequality and instability, while centralized systems improved coordination and social protection, yet often limited flexibility and efficiency. Performance, not ideology, exposed these trade-offs. Ultimately, economic outcomes reflected less the purity of theory and more the realities of human behavior. Incentives shaped productivity, ambition concentrated influence, and institutions mediated how power was exercised. Regardless of system, individuals responded to rewards, risks, and authority, revealing that economic structures evolved around human nature rather than replacing it. New pressures began testing existing economic arrangements once again. Technological disruption, demographic shifts, environmental constraints, and rising inequality exposed tensions neither markets nor centralized systems could fully resolve alone. As societies confronted these challenges, long-standing debates resurfaced, not as ideological revival, but as renewed attempts to reconcile efficiency, stability, and social cohesion. In the end, history offered neither a definitive winner nor a permanent blueprint. Systems succeeded when they adapted to changing realities and faltered when they clung to ideological certainty. Markets generated innovation but required restraint. Centralized planning provided stability but demanded flexibility. What consistently endured was not capitalism or socialism in pure form, but the capacity to adjust institutions, incentives, and power structures over time. The decisive lesson was pragmatic rather than philosophical. Economic survival belonged to societies willing to evolve, learn from failure, and redesign themselves in response to human behavior and historical pressure.